Okay, folks, I do want to end the lecture on aggregate supply, aggregate demand, talking a little bit about the neutrality of money. So what do we mean by the neutrality of money? There was, earlier on in the history of macroeconomics, a debate as to whether or not the quantity of money actually mattered. That argument has largely been settled. So economists pretty much accept the notion that in the long run, the quantity of money is not going to have an effect on real GDP, or what we call real variables, including real GDP and real prices. In other words, it may have an impact on nominal GDP. People may be fooled in the short run to providing more labor because maybe they're seeing their wages go up. But if prices are going up as well, eventually people will figure out that their real wage, their inflation adjusted wage, hasn't gone up, and they will supply less labor. Or if you're a producer, you might be tricked into thinking in the short run, because you're seeing the price of your goods go up, what you're making, that you should produce more. But when you start looking at your costs, when you start looking at how much it costs you to get materials, how much it costs you to hire workers, you'll realize that your profits maybe haven't gone up. And so you'll conclude it's not worth going through all this extra effort. The reason I bring this up is because the quantity of money may matter in the short run, but in the long run, the quantity of money is going to show up almost entirely in terms of prices, so it's not going to have an effect on real output. All right, what I want to do is use the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. By the way, I've been using this lecture and this portion of the lecture for a long, long time. It predates Donald Trump by a long time, and so I'm going to bring in I'm going to use this model to explain events that happened during the 1930s that many economists led to the Great Depression, how this model shows or represents these events taking place, and then you can conclude whether or not this is an adequate model to use to get a big picture sense of what's happening in the economy. So, as you guys may have learned in U.S. history, in 1929, there was a stock market crash. This stock market crash led to a reduction in real GDP. By the way, I asked my dad. My dad was it was a life that was a life-changing event for my dad because apparently well, he turned 13 right around the time the economy went into a depression, and that changed the family's fortunes quite a bit. The family apparently went from being fairly well off to not being well off, and him having to go to work before he went to school, and a whole bunch of other things like that. And I asked him about the stock market crash, and he said the stock market crash really wasn't the thing that caused the Great Depression. There were a whole bunch of other things that happened at that time as well. In the words of Milton Friedman, who was also around, the stock market crash created what he'd like to describe as a garden variety recession, meaning that, from time to time the economy goes into recession. That's just the way things are. What happened afterwards is probably more accountable for the depression that followed. So one thing was that the government believed in balanced budget. So what do we mean by balanced budget? A balanced budget is when the total amount of money that the government takes in taxes equals the amount that they're spending. Well, or G in this particular instance. Well, if the government is taking less in tax revenues because there's less economic activity and they want to balance the budget, then they have to cut G, which is what they did. Another thing that happened was this Fed, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we get into money and banking. The Fed kind of stood by as the money supply was being destroyed. You might remember from your U.S. history classes, there were runs on the bank. People would hear these rumors about such and such bank not having enough in the way of deposits and making all these bad loans, and then people would line up to pull their money out. The Fed could have mitigated that by increasing the money supply, but they didn't. And then finally, another event that took place that we're kind of going through Smoot-Hawley round two, but I don't know what the historians will call this, is a trade war that was set off by these Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So the idea behind increasing tariffs is somehow you're going to reduce the amount that you import, and your neighbors are just going to stand around and do nothing. Well, that's not the way these things go. If you've been following the news, we've only really gotten into this trade war in the last few months. Trump has been threatening Canada, Mexico, our European allies, China, everybody with tariffs, and they're not exactly standing around doing nothing. They're looking at imposing their own kind of tariffs. So if the amount of our exports goes down by more than the amount of our imports because of a trade war, and again, in the U.S., we were not only a big exporter at the time, but exports was a bigger percentage of our GDP, of our total economy, then that's going to have a negative impact on us if our exports go down. By the way, I took this screen grab ages ago from the State Department website, not because I anticipated that Donald Trump or anybody like him was going to get elected. It's just that a lot of people may not believe me when why is this guy talking about Smoot-Hawley tariffs? I don't even know what these are. In this screen grab over here, I doubt it's still on our website. It was talking about the negative impact that these tariffs had on global trade, and how many economists and many historians believe that this aggravated the depression that we're already in. I just want to give you another point of view in case you don't believe me. All right, so using our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, how would we show this? Well, let's imagine that the stock market crash led to a drop in consumption and investment. That often happens with a stock market crash. People feel less wealthy, so they spend less. Also, businesses don't look, they don't see the future as being quite so bright. So we would show that as a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Then let's imagine that because of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, there was another leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. In other words, we're seeing exports drop by more than imports are dropping. So that's leading to a further drop in net exports. And then let's imagine that because the government wants to balance the budget, and the Fed, I lump the Fed in with the Fed is the head of in charge of monetary policy, but to me it doesn't make any difference whether we're talking about bad monetary policy or bad fiscal policy. It's going to have the same impact on aggregate demand. So what should happen as a result, according to our model? We should see lower levels of real GDP, and we should see deflation. We should see a drop in the price level. That's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. So the model may do a pretty good job of explaining the overall picture. I'm not saying it does a good job of explaining the details. In fact, one of the criticisms of this model is that there's too much aggregation. We lose out on the detail, and we make certain assumptions about the economy as a whole that may not be valid. Okay, but in terms of describing maybe what happened in the past, the average supply or demand model doesn't do a bad job. All right, the expenditure multiplier, what's this all about? There's an idea that if, let's say the government were to increase expenditures, maybe because the private sector isn't doing it, that could lead to a multiplier effect that would be greater than the amount of increase in government spending. So imagine that, let's say the government pumped 1,000. This could be 1,000 or $1 billion or $1 trillion into the economy. Imagine that whoever receives this $1,000 is going to, or trillion or billion or whatever it happens to be, is going to spend 60% of it. Then in the first round, we're going to see a $1,000 increase in GDP, but the people who receive this 1,000 are going to then spend 60% of that, which is going to lead to a total increase of 1,600. But then the people who receive this 600 are going to spend 60% of that, which will be another 360, which means that the total economic impact of this initial $1,000 injection is now 1960, and this process will continue until pretty much there's no more to squeeze out. There's no more to get out of this last 60% worth. And so this is the argument that a lot of economists, or at least some economists, make towards the government engaging in deficit spending. They say that it'll work its magic through the multiplier. I've got to tell you that a lot of economists are also very skeptical about this multiplier. And when you hear it used locally, when you hear something like here in San Diego, I remember the Chargers were talking about how big the multiplier was for their 8 home games, and that's why we had to build them a new stadium and stuff like that. Some of these estimators of the multiplier are really, really strain credulity. One thing that economists have done is they've gone back after the fact and they've looked at the size of multipliers, after certain policies have been initiated. And I'm just showing you this to let you know that the estimates of these multipliers are not only all across the board, but they depend on the state of the economy to begin with. So, like up here, for instance, we've got estimates of the government purchases multiplier by the Congressional Budget Office, anywhere between zero point 0.5 and 2.5. Then we've got another estimate by these economists, Cristiano, Eichenbach, and Rebello, that said it could be 1.05 when short-term interest rates are not zero, and 3.7 when short-term interest rates are expected to be zero. And then another estimate by Monticelli, Perotti, Trigari, and Bosconi, of 1.2 after 1 year and 1.5 after 2 years. And then we've got other multipliers. The point I'm trying to make is you've got to take these multiplier estimates with a grain of salt, because a lot of times you will see an increase in government spending and you may not see the commensurate increase in economic activity. Or, for instance, with a tax cut. If you put more money in people's pockets, the hope is that they'll spend it. But some people might decide that the best thing they could do with it is pay down debt. If that's what they do, that's good for them, but that may not lead to more economic activity. Do you see what I'm saying? All right, automatic stabilizers, what are they? These are government programs that have found their way into the modern economy, that do not require any kind of congressional or presidential action. So examples of some programs that are automatic stabilizers, things like unemployment insurance. In Before the Great Depression, if you lost your job, you better find another one because there was really nothing available for you to give you income. In the modern economy, if you lose your job, you're entitled to a certain amount of unemployment insurance. Or there's other programs as well, like food stamps, or there's another form of welfare for unemployed workers. Also, we've got a tax system where if you make more money, you see your tax rates go up. That's the bad news. And in the old days, we used to have tax rates as high as 70, 80, 90%. So you can imagine if all of a sudden you get kicked into one of those high tax brackets, you might decide it's not even worth working because you're going to hang on to very little of the next dollar earned. On the other hand, when the economy goes into a recession, a lot of people see a drop in their income. And as a result of this drop in income, they go down in terms of their tax brackets. They get bumped into a lower tax bracket. And so that might create more of an incentive to keep on working. But these are what are called automatic stabilizers. They happen without any kind of governmental or congressional action. So then the question is, what about economic stabilization? What are the things that lead or maybe don't lead the government to act in the case of an economy being thrown into a recession? Well, there's a whole bunch of lags that have to be overcome. The government used to be more activist in the post-war period until the 1970s, and then they discovered that they weren't as good at cushioning the blow of a recession as they thought they were. And one of the reasons is because of the lags. So the first lag that we have to overcome is a thing called the data lag. The data lag is the time it takes to realize that we're going into a downturn. It could be 2 straight quarters of negative GDP growth, but don't forget GDP has to be revised. Also, it may very well be that, the economy is still growing, but it's slowing down faster than we might realize. Once we realize that the economy is slowing down, the next lag is the wait and see lag. Policymakers may say, okay, we're going into recession, but this recession might be mild. Like the 2001 recession was very mild, and they probably didn't need to do anything about that. The economy probably was going to get out of it all on its own. So they're going to wait and see before they do anything. And then if they decide that they're going to do things, the next lag that we have to deal with is a legislative lag. So in our system, if they decide that there's going to be a stimulus, in other words, maybe there's going to be a tax cut to satisfy the Republicans and a spending increase to satisfy the Democrats, it's got to go through the legislative process, meaning all spending bills begin in the House, then they go to the Senate, then they go back, then they go to a conference committee, then it goes to the president, then hopefully he signs it. If he doesn't, it goes back, and then they have to figure out what he's going to want in order to sign it. Then it goes back to the. Oh my God, how long is that going to take? Think of how long it takes the government to do the simplest things, and you could see why the legislative lag could delay things even further. Then the next lag after we get past a legislative lag is a transmission lag. So let's say part of this stimulus is government spending on roads. The next thing the government has to do is they have to go through the process of announcing which roads are going to be fixed, or which bridges are going to be replaced, or which airports are going to be expanded upon. Whatever the case may be, that's a whole bureaucratic process. They've got to get bids from people. They've got to select the bid. If somebody feels that he was cheated, he can challenge it. That takes even longer. And then finally, the last lag, once people start getting to work on this, is a thing called the effectiveness lag. This is the amount of time that it can take for, let's say, contractors to order material, hire workers, get new equipment, and have it work its way through the economy. So I want to talk a little bit about the Great Recession and how it was in some ways different from other recessions. So the data lag was almost instantaneous. In other words, the economy was falling off a cliff in 2008, and the MBR kind of went back and backdated the start of the recession to December 2007. One thing to remember about 2008 was that it was a presidential election year, and the president's seat was open. All 435 members of the House were up for re-election. 30 some odd senators were up for re-election. And so the wait and see lag was almost immediate. There was a real sense of urgency. A lot of people thought we were going into another depression. They decided that they were going to put together a bill right away. I think this is the one where Nancy Pelosi said, the Republicans said, hey, we need time to read the bill. And she said, don't worry about reading the bill, just vote on it first and read it later. That happened. So the wait and see lag was really quick. You had 435 representatives in the House running around like chickens with their head cut off, thinking, "Oh my God, we're 30, 60 days out from election day, and we're not gonna win re-election." The legislative lag was very, very fast by congressional standards. When President Obama got elected, he said he wanted to have a bill on his desk to sign by Inauguration Day. It didn't quite happen by Inauguration Day, but he did get it by President's Day. And by congressional action, that is very, very quick. All right, what about the transmission lag? 6 months or even a year later, well, 6 months, only about 10% of the money had been allocated to specific projects. A lot of people were saying, okay, what's going on? A lot of people in 2009, 2010 were saying, well, what's going on? How come it doesn't seem like this is having much of an impact? And finally, to President Obama's credit, I'll give him credit for this. In an interview in October 2010, he admitted that there's no such thing as shovel-ready projects. In other words, the idea behind a shovel-ready project is, hey, look, all we got to do is approve this money, and there's a guy with a shovel ready to get to work, right? Well, that's not the way the government works. Of course, a lot of us who've been around long enough knew that. And when people were scratching their heads saying, okay, why is this not helping the economy get out of a recession as late as 2010? He said, well, that's just the way things are. Another thing, at the time, the head of the Federal Reserve was a guy named Ben Bernanke. Another thing I just wanted to bring up, I'm not going to test you guys on this, but I do think it's interesting. You couldn't have had a better person at the helm of the Federal Reserve than Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke is widely regarded to be the foremost scholar of the Great Depression. A pretty smart guy. He was a professor at Princeton before joining the Federal Reserve. Before he joined the Federal Reserve, he was actually working on a book called The Age of Delusion, How Politicians and Central Bankers Created the Great Depression. He got an advance from a publisher to write this book. But as a term of employment, he couldn't do that while he was head of the Federal Reserve. And don't ask me what happened to this book, because I haven't seen it on the shelves or anything, even though he eventually wound up completing a second term. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was his first term was up in 2010, and there were actually rumors swirling around that President Obama wanted to replace him. Now, I couldn't think of a worse decision. I mean, here it's sort of like you're on the Titanic and it's going down, and they want to fire the captain. That would not inspire optimism in the market. So thankfully, President Obama thought it through. Thankfully, he realized he had the right guy in the job. Thankfully, he didn't replace him in 2010. He waited till 2014 to replace him, and Bernanke got to serve out a second term as opposed to finishing his term right in the middle of the Great Recession, so to speak. So thanks a lot, folks. I will be posting more lectures to come as well.